All right, here we go. So, we are going to look at two more biblical stories. Again, we're looking at this from the perspective of just having a broader understanding of culture and literature, and this stuff is in TV shows and movies, and making sure we just have a basic understanding of stories. I'm not trying to teach you religion, although I would recommend that you do read the Bible if you have never read it, just to get a sense of what some of these stories are for yourself. I know I am covering them very quickly. So, we're going to start today with the story of David and Goliath. And I'm willing to bet you have probably heard of this story. It's in the book of Samuel. Sorry, it's in the book of First Samuel. Excuse me. Samuel did write two books, written by Samuel. And Samuel was a prophet of God. That's kind of his role. And Samuel's first job was to find a king for Israel. And so God told Samuel, go and find a king. And he found King Saul. King Saul was king of the Israelites. And at one point, the Philistines, which were the evil, I don't know, whatever, they were the enemies of Israel. Okay. And so we have the Philistines and the Israelites, and they're here and they're about ready to battle. And the Philistines have this one warrior who is gigantic, and his name is Goliath. And we're not entirely sure. I mean, we are told he was a giant, but from what I've understood, records say that he was between 7 and 9 feet tall. So think of some of the biggest basketball players in the NBA, and then maybe another 2 feet taller than those guys. So this guy was huge. Anyway, he challenged the Israel army, and he said, anyone, just send one person. I'm only one person. Send one person out here to battle me. And if you can defeat me, then the whole Philistine army will go away. All right. So David, and you've probably heard of King David, but this is the first story that David really gets his name, becomes popular. So David was the youngest son, and all of his brothers were in the military serving under King Saul. And David was a shepherd boy, and he would watch his father's sheep, and he would take care of the sheep, and mostly just kind of lived a quiet shepherd life. All right. And so David at one time decides he's going to go visit his brothers. So he walks over to where the battle is, and he kind of comes to say hi to his brothers and bring them some food. And Goliath comes out and he says, your God is nothing. The Philistines are great. Who will battle me? And David looks around. Nobody volunteers. Everybody seems scared, and David goes, well, I'll go. And the king laughs, and his brothers laugh and get irritated with him and say, shut up, go away. And David's like, no, really, I'll go. And one of the elements we can talk about more in just a moment, but the element of David having faith in his God. And so David feels that God is in control, and David goes, you know what, I'll do this fight for God. All right, so David goes over to the river. He picks out 5 stones out of the river, and he was good with a slingshot. Again, as this shepherd, he would use a slingshot to scare off wolves and bears and lions, and he would scare off these predators. And David goes, well, I've killed beasts before with a slingshot. I'll use this. And King Saul says, you're very brave. And he puts all of the armor, the heavy protective gear, the helmet, the breastplate, and all this gear. And David goes, I can't walk around in this. It's too heavy. It's too big. Take all this off. And so this young boy, David, walks out into the battlefield. And Goliath looks at this boy. He looks at the army and goes, are you kidding me? Is this the best you have to offer? You send a boy to battle me? Well, sure enough, David takes his slingshot. One rock. Right in Goliath's forehead. Goliath falls down dead. Okay, so that's the basic story. David kills Goliath with a slingshot. David the boy kills Goliath with his slingshot. So, why is it important? This is what we now have as the quintessential story about a younger, smaller foe defeating a large and powerful enemy. We use this now for all kinds of things. Anytime the smaller, weaker person, like or not King David, but the one who becomes King David, anyway, David the boy, anytime the smaller, weaker David takes on the big, giant, evil power, it's a David and Goliath scenario. And we use this phrase constantly, all the time in English. So, all right, how does this story connect to your life? Well, you have to ask yourself if size doesn't matter, right? Can the younger, smaller person defeat the larger, bigger, more powerful enemy? Okay. Have confidence when you face your fears. It's this idea David walked out bravely without fear. Um, Bigger doesn't always necessarily mean more powerful. And that's the basic story. Now, you could get more into this idea of David's faith. He was so confident in his faith in God that God would protect him that nothing bothered him. David's like, well, God's got my back, which then could lead you to ask questions about your own faith, your own view of God. If there is a God, does God have your back? Those kinds of questions. So, anyway, some of the ways that we see this story. So, there was, if you've ever watched the TV show Survivor, there was the David versus Goliath kind of setup. You'll see this idea here of this cartoon of debt, a person versus mountains of debt. So if you've graduated from college, you probably have, 10 or 20 or $50,000 of debt. And that makes you the small person looking at this insurmountable, impossible enemy. So there we go. There was the TV show on Amazon, which is Goliath, which is literally the idea of a lawyer, a small-time lawyer, just him taking on these big, giant lawyer enemies, right? And so, can the weaker, smaller person defeat the big, huge, rich company? And down here we have this idea: was this How I Met Your Mother? And apparently, one of the things on it was the Goliath National Bank, and this idea of taking on the Goliath Bank as kind of that evil corporate entity. So that's some of the ways we see David and Goliath today. All right. The book of Job, and I absolutely love the story of Job. And we are specifically going to reference this when we get to the story night later in the year. So it's unsure who wrote the book of Job. It might have been Moses. It might have been Job himself. We're not exactly sure on who the author is. But the book of Job is included in the Old Testament of the Bible. We're not exactly sure when Job lived. I think most people agree that Job was a real person. But anyway, so it could have been 1490 to 1950 BC. And remember, when you're talking about BC, you kind of count the years backwards. But anyway, all right. So here's the basic story. Job was this rich man. He just kind of had lots of land. And back in biblical times, a person's wealth was measured by their stock, right? Their livestock, their animals. So he had probably lots of cows and lots of sheep, maybe a few pigs, I don't know, but just lots of animals that would support his kind of industry. And a wealthy man, big family. And so the story starts like this. Satan goes to God, and Satan says, you know what, God? Job only loves you because his life is blessed. Look, he's rich. He's got an easy, nice life. That's why Job loves you, God. And God says, well, I don't think so. I think Job loves me because he loves me, and he'll love me in any circumstances. So I tell you what, Satan, you can do whatever you want to Job, but you may not kill Job. So the rules are, do anything you want, just don't kill him. So Satan attacks Job. He kills his family, his wife and his children. He destroys his livestock and his crops. He destroys his home, And he gives Job a plague of the skin where he has these boils and these wounds that just are all over his skin, terribly painful. And Job is left with nothing. And he's a broken, broken man. And Job, for a while, still praises God. And Job says, God, I don't know what's going on, but you are still God of the universe. And then Job gets sad, and some of his friends come along. And his friends basically say, hey, you know what, Job, you must have done something really bad. Like, God must be really pissed at you. Like, the only people who get punished like this are sinners. So, Job, you must be a sinner. And Job goes, no, I have not sinned. I've done nothing wrong. I don't know what's happening. And eventually, Job cries out to God and says, I don't understand. I curse the day I was born. And God doesn't really answer Job. Instead, what God says is, do you know how to put the stars in the heavens? Do you know how the oceans work? Do you know how the creatures find food to eat? And God kind of puts Job in his place. And Job is kind of left realizing God is God and I am just a human. And that's one of the points. God is God, right? So, in the end, Job still praises God, and God ends up restoring everything to Job. New family, new money, rebuilds everything, and Job lives to old age in a blessed life. So that's the basic story of Job. Now, what does this mean? Well, now, when we think of Job, anytime someone mentions Job, okay, we're talking about this idea of human suffering. Does God care? Is there justice in this world? Do bad people get bad things? Do good people get good things? Do bad people get good things? And do good people get bad things, right? These are all the questions that we can ask when we look at stories like this. So, how about you in your life? When bad things happen, is it a result of your bad behavior? Or are you a good person and you still have bad things happening to you? And if you're a good person and bad things happen to you, what do you do with that? What does that mean? Is there meaning in this world? All right. So these are the big questions that the book of Job causes us to ask. I would like to lastly point out the idea of Job with a capital J is not job, like I have a job working at Target, or I have a job working at the gas station. So Job and job are different. Capital J is the big difference. So whenever you see a capital J, Job, we are talking about this character. And I promise you, at some point, you will see it somewhere. All right. So that's, and here are some of the maybe cultural connections. We will talk about it at night. Let's see here. There was a Pulitzer Prize winning play published in the 50s that retells the story of Job through two circus performers who take on the roles of Satan and God. And I bring that up not because I have ever read it, but because it was a Pulitzer Prize winning story. And so that's a pretty big deal. I also have never seen the episode of South Park, but apparently, let's see here. Kyle's parents tell him the story of Job to try and cheer him up, but instead Kyle is horrified that God would allow a man to suffer so badly. And so anyway, even South Park uses this story. In Fahrenheit 451, which I do hope you will read someday at some point, Montag, the main character in that story, is communicating with one of the other characters, Faber, and Faber begins to read him the book of Job. Okay, and the connection here is the idea that Montag is suffering the way Job suffered. Okay, and so Montag becomes a similar character to Job and how they suffer. All right, and yet Job still remains God's servant, and therefore Montag should still fulfill his role in what he has to accomplish and do. All right, so those are the last two stories. The next thing we're going to talk about real quick is simply Jesus. And he doesn't really have a single book written about him. If you know the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are specifically about Jesus's life. If you wanted to read, I would say go to Matthew, read the book of Matthew, and you get a pretty quick breakdown of who Jesus is. Briefly, if you know Christmas, you know about Jesus' birth. If you know about Easter, you know about Jesus' death. These are worldwide cultural celebrations, and they all celebrate around the man of Jesus. So if you are not familiar with Jesus, again, you don't have to believe in Christianity or Catholicism, but I mean, you got to be familiar with the story in our Western culture. So the basic story, Jesus is God's son, and I won't get into the craziness of the Trinity, but we'll just leave it at simplistic version here. Jesus is God's son. Jesus came to save humanity. He was born as a baby, which we celebrate as Christmas. He then lived his life. He taught about faith in God and how to love God and how to love other people. And then eventually he was crucified as a false god. And you have probably seen pictures of Jesus on the crucifix, right? Jesus on the cross. All right, and then the Christian story continues that he rose again from the dead after 3 days, and that Jesus now awaits in heaven where he will someday return and judge all evil. So that is the very basic Christian outlook on who Jesus is. So why is this important? Well, Jesus is a central figure and you cannot escape him. You just cannot escape who Jesus is. So you do need to at least have some understanding because you'll hear him everywhere. Okay? It's not just a curse word when people go, Jesus Christ, right? They're actually there's a reason why people talk about Jesus. So in terms of literature, Jesus becomes an archetype. Okay, this idea of we're able to notice similar themes and trends in characters. So the self-sacrificing, humble servant, and often the character comes back to life in some way. So this is a fascinating thing, and there are people who spend literally their entire lives just looking at this idea of the archetype. So very quickly, if you know the Superman movies or the Superman story, you have this superpower from another planet, from outside of Earth, coming to Earth to save humanity. Superman does in the movies die, and then he comes back to life in the movies, right? I love Star Trek here. Spock, he is saving the ship and he dies in the process. And then in the next movie, he comes back to life. It's very exciting. Gandalf, if you've watched the Lord of the Rings movies or read the stories, he is definitely a Jesus Christ-like figure. He is this outside power who comes and he's helping these characters on their journey. He does die, but then he raises back to life with new, bigger, stronger powers. Harry Potter, similar themes. The Passion of the Christ is a movie that's still constantly played and viewed, especially around Easter time. Neo in The Matrix, which is an amazing movie. Okay, he is a Christ-like figure. Narnia, if you've ever watched the movies Narnia or read the books, and I highly recommend reading the books because they're a lot of fun. But Aslan the lion, he is the creator of Narnia. Aslan the lion protects Narnia. Aslan dies to protect his people, and then Aslan comes back to life. We see these things. Scarlet Letter is a great story that has some of those Jesus characters. To Kill a Mockingbird in certainly in Atticus in that his savior situation. Grapes of Wrath, Jim Casey. Look at the initials of Jim Casey. JC, right? Jim Casey. Jesus Christ. JC. All right. Tale of Two Cities, Lord of the Flies. These are just some of the books you are likely to encounter in high school that have some similar Jesus archetypes. So Familiarize yourself with Jesus. Also, here are a whole bunch of other stories that we're just not going to have time to go into, but um, water into wine, walking on the water, healing the sick, bringing people back from the dead, feeding 5,000, calming the storm. These are all the miracles that Jesus did, and you will see these ideas referenced so many things. Okay, when we know about like someone thinks they're so special, important, we'll say something like, "Well, yeah, they can't walk on water, right? They're not Jesus." Okay, things like that. Parables. These are stories that Jesus actually told to try and teach lessons. They're like fables, little moral stories. The sower and the seed, where the good seed grows and the bad seed falls away and dies. The hidden treasure. You sacrifice everything to get the most valuable thing. The hidden treasure is buried. Somebody finds this treasure, they rebury it, and then they buy the land so that the treasure can be theirs because the treasure is more valuable than anything else. The lost sheep. If you are a shepherd and you lose a sheep, that's valuable, it's important. Jesus goes and finds the lost sheep. Go find it, it's special. And then the prodigal son, we should probably spend time just doing the prodigal son, but basically it's this son who rejects his family and he takes his money and he goes off and parties and then he comes back broken, poor, disgusted with himself, and he says to his father, "Father, let me just be a servant working in your house because my life on my own was miserable." And the father goes, "No, my son was dead, but he's alive. He's come back." And so we use this phrase, the prodigal son, when we talk about people who've gone away, maybe done some crazy, wild things they shouldn't have done, and then they come back, they've learned their lesson, they've grown to be better people. Whew. Covering a lot, I know. So that is just a very quick breakdown of some of the big stories in the Bible that good critical readers will be aware of. So, my first recommendation, go read it yourself. My second recommendation, pay attention to movies and books and cartoons because so many of these things will make references to these stories and you want to be able to understand the allusions. You want to be able to make that connection. That's what's going to be most valuable to you as a English literature reader. All right, you guys, that's going to do it for now. So thanks for paying attention, and we'll catch you on the flip side.